Hello and welcome back to these lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today we'll be exploring this sentence, which states, correct oneself and transform others. This sentence is quite unique because unlike the other sentences that we've been discussing, that deal mostly with cultivating ourselves, our character, this part here talks about how the cultivation of our character then relates to our influence on others. And, that's really the million-dollar question, isn't it? How is it that we can help others change and develop and help them? So changing and helping others change is something that's quite difficult, but it's something that is quite vital in many, many professions. So if you work in the education sector, for example, you'll be wanting to empower the students, coaching them, educating them. If you're in even the health profession, it's about guiding patients, helping them understand healthier ways of living, helping them understand their particular illness and how to live with it, improve their way of life, their quality of life. And then even in the business sector, whether it's, even if it's not for profit, any level of management will involve some form of wanting to motivate personnel, human resources to work together in fulfilling and achieving the organizational goals and mission. So all of these different verbs, educate, guide, manage, all of these are in some ways related to this idea of transformation, helping others change, improve and develop. And so, that is in relation to our work lives, but even in terms of our personal lives, if parents want to help their children work harder, any kind of habit, form any kind of habit, better habit. I also speak to adult children who are adults, obviously, who then want to help their parents live healthier lives. I also talk to, sometimes there are couples, partners who want to help each other. And again, it's this whole idea of change. How is it that I can change the other person, help them? So transformation here, this word is a key word, and it's worth exploring it further. Now, in Chinese, this character at the top, as you can see, is made up of two parts. But actually, the original form, according to the earliest Chinese dictionary, the Shuowenjiezi, tells us that the original form was just the part on the right. And it's meant to depict a person who is sort of turned upside down, who's standing on their, standing on their heads. So in a way, like the photo here. And why is this particular sketch meant to represent the idea of change or transformation? Is because that's when someone's completely changed. You don't usually see someone standing on their heads. But on another level, it's meant to represent sort of being completely changed on a deeper level. So it's not just superficial from our appearance or our words, but from our understanding and our thoughts. There's a sort of English phrase, which I've noted here, turn something on its head. So which is when we think of an idea in a new and innovative way, that from a perspective that you might not have thought of before. And that's what this change is about, sort of changing the way we see things, which then obviously relates to how we act and what we say later on. So this word is also used when we talk about, in Chinese chemistry, that idea of, two elements coming together to form a new substance, and that means that these elements, primary elements, are then transformed. It's like when you bake a cake and you put together flour, sugar, oil, eggs, etc. And after you open the oven and the cake is baked, you can't really extract the original ingredients anymore. That's what that idea of transformation. Now, from an individual point of view, what does it mean to be transformed? Well, I remember I had a colleague who was a smoker, and she knew, of course, that smoking was bad for your health. I know if you are in Australia, you'd know that on the cigarette packets, there's quite graphic images of the consequences of smoking, lung cancer, etc. And on some level, all smokers know that this is bad for them. But one day, I remember she told me that she'd quit, and I asked her, what is it that made her change? And she said that actually one of her good friends passed away, and it was because of a smoking-related illness. And so that really sort of turned her life upside down, in the sense that it really hit home that this smoking was something that could be life-threatening for even someone of a young age. So this was, you could say, this was transformative, and there was no going back. She quit for life. So this is the idea of transformation in a way. It's not just a superficial change. And transformation, as we said, can occur on many levels, on an individual level, a societal level, and even on a national level. And when we think about that, then we realize it's quite related. This idea of, correcting ourselves to be able to transform others is related to leadership and different sort of leadership styles that enable sort of team members, their team members to then change. There's a really wonderful anecdote that is found in a text called the Garden of Stories. It was compiled about 2,000 years ago, and they're not fictional stories, they're actually historical accounts from early China. And there's a wonderful story or anecdote in here about two students of Confucius. So one is called Fu Zijian, otherwise known as Mi Zijian, and another student was Wu Ma Qi. They were both very accomplished students, so much so that they both became governors of a certain district called Shanfu. And Fu Zijian was governor of this particular district in an earlier stage. And it was recorded that when he was the governor, it was there was great stability, order in the region, but his style of leadership was quite unique. It was said that he had so much time on his hands that during work hours he was like playing music, playing the Chinese zither, the guqin, and really enjoying himself. It seemed like it was quite easy, and yet the place was very well run. On the other hand, Almaty, who later succeeded him, found that all of his waking hours, from very early in the morning to very late at night, he was just inundated with work, all his administrative tasks, and he was completely exhausted. And one day when he met Fu Zijian, he asked him a secret, what's so different? We're both governing this place and yet both achieving quite good results. But why is it that I'm so, overworked and exhausted? And Fu Zijian said, well, quite simply, we have different styles. You could say that I employ the people. I employ my people, but you employ their labor. And what did that mean? Basically, he was trying to say that his style of leadership was such that he could delegate responsibility to people that he felt that he could trust. He had confidence in their skills and talents, and they could be the ones making the decision. And as a result, he was quite confident in them, and therefore, as a result, his own workload was reduced. On the other hand, Almaty was someone who, yes, he had employed ministers, etc., officials, but he needed to oversee their every decision. He needed to approve everything, and therefore it meant that there was a lot of work that he needed to do. You could call him, in modern terms, a minute manager. So that was the difference. But on top of that, in the same text, we read of a conversation between Confucius and Fu Zetian, in which Fu Zetian describes his leadership style in a bit more detail. So Confucius had heard about the great and effective governance of his student, and also wanted to know the secret. Now, Fu Zetian said, well, the way I govern is that, depending on who I encounter, I sort of treat them in the way that's specific and appropriate for their particular roles. So if there are these particular people are parents, I will treat them as if as parents, and if there are children, then I will care for them and be concerned about them as if children. I will also make sure that the widows, widowers, orphans are well protected. So helping the vulnerable in the community. To this, Confucius replied, he said, that sounds really great. And of course, you'll win over the support and the cooperation of perhaps the common people, these vulnerable. But it doesn't sound like that's enough. Fu Zetian then said, well, actually, there's also something else that I do. Well, there's about 3 people who I see as my own parents. There are 5 people who I would consider my own elder siblings. And then there are 11 who I treat as my close friends. To this, Confucius replied, well, that's great, because obviously through the way that you interact with these people, you're providing a great role model. If you are treating these people as your parents, then you're teaching the population about family reverence. If you are treating certain people as if your own elder siblings, then you are teaching them about the virtue of fraternity, what we covered last week. There's respect for elders. And then between friends, there's this virtue of trustworthiness and ultimately learning from each other. So, of course, by doing that, you're providing exemplary behavior and conduct. But Confucius felt that still this wasn't sufficient. This might win over people who would be able to read that and understand Fu Zetian, his conduct, and learn from it. But what about others? And then finally, Fu Zetian said that, well, actually, there's something else that he does. There's about 5 people who he sees as being worthies. So the people who have great virtue, like much more virtuous than himself, with much more talent. And for these people, he treats them as if his teachers. And he's almost like their student, or in his words, a servant. So he serves them in a sense, and he's able to learn from them, and they teach him about how to govern. And it is then that Confucius replies, this is the essence of effective government. Confucius says that the exemplary rulers, the sage rulers of the past, like King Yao and King Shun, this was their secret as well, that they would, and through their humility, their openness, they were able to learn from anyone, from a commoner, from people younger than them, older than them, etc. And that was the key to their success. So you can see here that Fu Zetian, his style of leadership is very interesting, that he's able to really provide that kind of, because through his humility, through his modeling and exemplary behavior, he's able to then instill that kind of transformative effect on the people, leading to sort of order and stability. And this is actually a very important idea in the political philosophy of early Confucianism. Again, in the same text, it talks about how government, there's 3 types of government. Now, the true king is that of the Confucian model, which operates through moral transformation. So the leader providing moral leadership, providing an example through their own behavior, their words, their actions of how it is to, relate to others. For example, through filiality, fraternity, being a friend, respect, etc. However, there were other forms of government that were apparent in that point in history. For example, that of being an overlord. Now, that means that this was a form of government in which law and order was instilled through, but the order and stability came about through the authority of the government. But this is also very different from that of an autocratic state, autocratic type of government, which operates through intimidation. So threatening others with punishment, so much so that, people would not dare to transgress the law. So you can see, of course, that in the first form of government, that of a true king, it's about sort of educating people to understand what is virtue, how they can interact with others in a harmonious way for the benefit of the entire community. The overlord uses authority, sort of a reward and punishment kind of model, and the autocratic state operates mainly through this idea of punishment. Now, in this second sentence, it talks about how, yes, there are these 3 modes of government which has its uses, but transformation, the first kind, is the most the superior form of government. And you can see, of course, that for Wu Zetian, his kind of government is through that idea of moral transformation. The different types of leadership, of course, is something that even today, in business management literature, you'll see shelves in bookstores and in libraries talking about, how to be the best leader. And of course, one of these texts I would like to share with you today, and that is, it's written by Jim Collins, who is a lecturer at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. And in his particular text, he talks about his 5-year research project, in which he looked at a cross-section of various companies throughout history who, for some reason or another, originally only had sort of mediocre performances in terms of financial outcomes, but then later were transformed and became great companies. And the so-called great companies were companies that had superior financial outcomes over a period of 15 years. And when analysing these various companies, he sort of distilled what were the main factors in which a company changed from being good to great. And so that's the title of his text. Now, one of these factors was leadership, what he calls level 5 executive leadership, which is at the bottom here. But this level 5 leadership, the best leadership, is based on the earlier 4 forms of leadership. So the level 5 leader has all the qualities of the earlier levels and more. So let's look at the earlier qualities now. So first of all, you can see level 1 leader is someone who's really capable. They're very talented, knowledgeable, have great skills, and also good work ethics. And as a result, they make productive contributions to the organization. The second type of leader is someone who, on top of that, so on top of their skills, knowledge, they're able to contribute as a team member, in the sense that they're able to work together with others, collaborate with others to achieve group objectives. So they have an extra element of this teamwork and collaborative skills. Level 3 is someone on top of that who is an effective manager. They can organize others towards these, certain tasks and objectives. And they can be quite efficient about it. So that's the competent manager. The next level up is someone who can do all of that but more. They can actually sort of motivate others towards a very clear and compelling vision. And because they're able to motivate, inspire others, then they stimulate higher performance in the staff. But there's actually more. And this is the level 5 executive leadership, which Jim Collins, through his research, discovered. And she says that these types of leaders, yes, they're talented, yes, they're knowledgeable, are great team workers, work great in the team, manage effectively, can lead and motivate others. But on top of that, they build greatness because they have a paradoxical blend of humility and professional will. So this drive to achieve their mission, and this drive to bring together everyone towards this high goal. So, and when I read that, it made me think of Fu Zetian, in the sense that yes, he's got this these knowledge, these skills about how to recruit the right people, appoint talented members. So he knows and he can see who's right for the job. And then at the same time, he's able to bring them together towards this government and manage them effectively. And at the same time, he's also modeling the right behavior. But on top of that, as you can see in his reply to Confucius, he's also very humble because he acknowledges that others are much better than him in different levels, and he treats them as teachers, and then able to sort of leverage the combined synergies to the extent that his workload is greatly reduced, and then he's able to enjoy his work, and very, very different from his colleague Wu Maqi. So you can see, of course, that this idea of leadership, or how to transform others, is much more complicated than we might think. And the real catch here, or the real crux of the issue, is how we act ourselves. So as the treatise tells us, we have to correct ourselves before we can transform others. So in other words, we can only develop others as much as we can develop ourselves. Very easy to understand. We can only teach someone as much as we know. You can't be teaching university maths if you only know high school maths. But on top of this idea of leadership, or helping others develop, helping others change, is not just about how much we've studied or researched, or how much we've talked at them. It's actually about how much we've done. Have we walked the talk? And by doing so, we accumulate experiences, we understand what it takes to really change, to really improve ourselves, to better ourselves. And as a result, you can really identify and empathize with others who are on that same road, that same path, except you've walked further on that path. So you can then guide them and also be guiding light for them in your example. So this idea of transforming others, if we want to help others change, if we want to see change in others, then it goes back to the first part, which is to correct ourselves. Now, a very common question, stop sharing for a while, very common question that people ask is, why is it that I've changed myself? And, I work really hard, whether it's housework, in the workplace, or, on a financial level, I contribute a lot. But the people around me, they don't seem to be doing the same thing. But they're not emulating me. They don't seem to be inspired. And yet I am putting 100% of my effort in already. Now, what can I do? Haven't I already corrected myself? So and this is where the treatise helps us, right? Because now it's not about what we mean by transformation. It's about what we mean by correcting ourselves. So it's not about what we do, but how we do it as well. And that's quite critical. So, how is it that we can, it's not about, as we can see through the different leadership levels, it's not about being great in a particular skill or talent ourselves, but how is it that we can share that with others, sort of inspire them with our own passion, enthusiasm, and our own excitement to the extent that it's infectious, and they want to emulate us, and they're willing to do so even without us, prodding them along, forcing them in any way. So, in other words, living our lives in a way that shows others that this is the better way to live. This is, a way in which, makes me a better person. I'm very happy, healthy, etc. And through that, then how we live our lives becomes then something that others would want to emulate. So this is that idea of correct. And I think that in answer to that very common question, misconception, Mencius has a very good piece of advice for us. And so Mencius tells us that the trouble with people lies in their desire to be the teachers of others. So the teacher here is not someone who has necessarily, a degree in education, but a person who wants to try to be kind of like a teacher, in the sense, when we think of a teacher, we think of someone who is standing at the front of a classroom and dictating, what others should learn and how they should learn, etc. In the sense that, when people want others to change, they get to the point where they're telling others how they should act, what they should do, and then, in a way, they want to control others. They want to manage others, or really just dictate to others and hope that they change in that way. So Mencius pointed this out over 2,000 years ago. And it's something still that is quite common, in the sense that, when we want others to change, we become impatient. Maybe we remind them frequently, and to the point that it becomes nagging. And then on top of that, then there's stress, there's tension in the relationship, there's a fallout in the relationship. And then, it becomes almost impossible to really communicate and really help them change. So this is something that we need to be quite mindful of, that the correct oneself comes first before we can transform others. And note here, it doesn't say correct others or change others, but to transform them. And talk about a bit later about how this connection works. So in order to really correct ourselves, then, the collected commentaries of the Exalted Treatise tells us that it has to start from ourselves, of course, and more importantly, our thoughts. So we have to know what we're thinking at any particular point in time. Are we sincere? What we tell others to do, is that what we are doing ourselves? And is that something that we really believe in? Or is it something that we just hope others will do, but we don't really have that same conviction? So, I think, in terms of trying to bring these ideas together, what I'd like to do now is to now look at someone who really has that transformative power, someone who we all know, who was able to instill change in his time, but also thousands of years later. So I'd like to talk about Confucius and what he did in his daily life that his students reported. They picked up on this. In other words, this was something that he always did. He wasn't just putting on a show. So I've sort of extracted a few observations that's recorded in the Analects that I'd like to share with you now. So the first one is about Confucius and how it seems that every time he enters this grand temple, which is where the sort of the ancestral hall or temple, it's also called, and where the sort of ancestral commemoration ceremonies and sacrifices occurs. So when he goes there, he seems to ask questions about what's happening and the ritual and where things are placed. So asks about anything. And this observation is actually something that's recorded in the Analects twice. Now, this was not like a copy error or publication error, but it shows that this is something that he did often, and also something that students felt that was important. Why is that? Now, in this first passage, the same passage occurs later on, but this passage is much more detailed because it also says that, when someone heard about Confucius, this particular observation, they said, well, I thought that Confucius was really learned, that he was quite erudite. He knew all about these rituals. But why is it then that he has to ask about everything? In other words, this person is sort of insinuating that perhaps Confucius is not as learned as people might claim, or as his reputation claims. And then when Confucius heard this is what he said, that actually asking is part of the ritual. Asking is part of ritual propriety. This is what I should be doing. Well, why is that? So according to the commentaries, Confucius at that time was probably the official who was in charge of the conduct of these ancestral ceremonies, which occurred regularly throughout the year. And he would visit the temple sort of prior to these ceremonies in order to oversee and check on what was happening. Now, when he goes there, of course, he doesn't sort of just assume that he knows everything, but he defers to the authority and the expert at the Grand Temple, at this ancestral temple, who would perhaps know more about, what the ceremony. And so he's sort of really cautious about the entire affair, this entire ceremony, and is trying to sort of be really careful that everything that happens is according with the ritual. And so that's why he is very humble and he asks questions. He doesn't just assume things. And so this, of course, shows us that even someone who is as learned as Confucius, who already has this great reputation, and yet he's able to, because of his reverence and respect for the ceremony, and therefore respect and reverence for the ancestors, something very important, remembering those who've come before us, then he is able to sort of put his ego aside and make sure that everything goes according to the ritual and as it should be, that nothing goes wrong. And therefore, he asks questions about everything. So that's one observation about Confucius in his work life. And what about his daily life? So he says this is quite a very simple observation. It says that he would not sit unless his mat was straight. Now, the first time I thought about, read this, you might think that he's quite fastidious. So some sort of OCD. But actually, when you read the commentaries, it's quite clear. There are actually two interpretations here, generally two interpretations, and it relates to this idea of straight. Now, one of the interpretations is that this idea of straight related to proper seating. Now, in those days, there were no chairs. And, when you sat down, it was often on a mat rather than a chair. And therefore, this particular observation is that Confucius will not sit unless it was the proper place to sit. In those days, of course, if you were seated in a table, the different, the seating arrangement was quite particular, and the seating was related to your title, rank, your position relative to other people on the same table. So, for example, even today, in a very sort of Asian form of etiquette is the seating arrangement. The person who is seated facing the entrance is considered the most important person. Often that is where the guest of honor might sit. And then on the other hand, the person who sits with their back to the door is considered the person who has the lowest sort of title or position in that on that table. And so where you sat would then reflect your role, your position in relation to others. So, Confucius, if he was, say, for example, a lower level kind of official, then he would have to be very careful. But even, if he was quite senior, he would also need to be careful where he sat in respect to other people on the table. The other interpretation is that he would not sit unless his mat, the physical appearance of his mat was straight. Now, when we think about it from a modern day equivalent, that might be sort of not sitting unless the chair was in the right sort of position. So not seated with the chair, facing another side, for example. And it's very interesting because Michael Pewitt, who's a professor of Chinese studies at Harvard, proposes that this shows us that Confucius understood that these daily sort of actions were things that had far-reaching consequences, and it, not just what you might think of as OH&S. If you don't sit right, your posture is affected, but it's actually more than that. So Michael Pewitt explains that realizing that these little actions can actually affect the mood of others and help others feel better. So, for example, if you look at this particular photo, the table is well set out, when you go to a restaurant. And this would, the feeling and the atmosphere that achieves is very different from, if the cutlery, bowls, plates were just thrown on the table. And therefore, if you're able to attend to these little details in life, that, the things around you are ordered, it's not necessarily for your own comfort, but for the comfort of others, helping them feel comfortable in such a, neat and tidy environment. And therefore, the idea then is that this ritual is about respect for others, that, through your sincerity, that kind of focus, attention, and care in the minutiae of life, that you're able to then affect changes and change the mood and feelings of others through that care for how they might feel through just simply the appearance of the things around them. So that's another interpretation that again shows that Confucius was not just sitting down, but had other considerations at hand and thinking about others. Now, when he sat down, what was he eating? How was he eating? There's actually another observation about this in the Analects, and it's quite a long extract, and I've just sort of taken out some points. So it says here, he would not eat in excess, even when presented with refined grain or finely minced meat. And this is sort of like, if we were given our favorite food, really nice food, and we might eat more than we should, have extra servings. For Confucius, this sort of refined grain or finely minced meat would be that kind of nice food. Not something that you have every day. But it says here that even when presented with this fine food, you would still eat it as if normal. So you wouldn't eat it to excess, like take extra servings. So that shows a level of moderation and also self-discipline. Next, it says that he would not eat anything that was improperly cooked. This relates to, being undercooked or overcooked. And this is just sort of simple general principles about food hygiene. So certain, say for example, meats or even some vegetables, they need to be completely cooked. They can't be sort of half raw. Otherwise, it might lead to food poisoning. So that's the idea here, that it's about food hygiene. You would also not eat anything that was gathered out of season. So in other words, eat seasonal vegetables. And of course, this meant that these vegetables were the most abundant at that time, was easily grown at that time, as opposed to eating vegetables that might be out of season, that might be more rare. It would take a lot more sort of work and effort in order to really cultivate these vegetables, and might not be in keeping with sort of the seasonal cycles, that idea of being out of sync or not in harmony with nature. So Confucius not only thought about, what was on the table, whether it was healthy or not, but also this idea of, eating with seasonal vegetables. Also says that he would not eat any meat that had been improperly butchered or improperly butchered. So this idea is not that it wasn't cut right. So there's obviously some commentaries talk about how it might relate to meat that wasn't sliced or cut in the right way. But actually, in fact, it's cut or chopped versus butchered are two sort of different concepts, in the sense that this idea of butchered is how the animal has been slaughtered. Now, we know that in the past, in early China, people didn't eat meat every day. So common people would not eat meat every day. They would only eat meat on special occasions, for example, when they had, so they would only slaughter the animals for the ancestral sacrifices, these important ceremonies. And these sacrifices, these offerings of meat, were a sign of respect for their ancestors. And then as a result, people would eat meat after the ceremonies. So it wasn't every day. And because the animal was slaughtered specifically for these ceremonies or certain special occasions, there was a sort of regulation as to how it was done, a particular time of day, direction that the animal might face, sort of quite detailed rules. A modern day equivalent would be eating halal meat, for example. So that for halal meat, the animal has been slaughtered to certain standards and regulations in a certain way. And that's sort of the same principle here. And so it says that Confucius will not eat it if it had not been slaughtered in the right way, or, in this case also the right timing, if it's not the special occasion. And then finally, it says here that that he would not eat anything that had not been properly seasoned. Now, the particular seasoning is very difficult to try to confirm or corroborate at this stage. What kind of sauce was he using? We don't know for sure. But certainly it tells us that, certain foods, we know that certain foods at that time had to have certain flavors which would affect how it might be digested, for example, how it might sort of work within the body towards that Chinese theory of the 5 phases of how certain foods then correspond to the functioning of certain organs within the body. And the flavors as well also correspond to the internal workings of the human organs. And therefore, this seasoning was not just for taste, but actually for health reasons. Now, I also realized here that when it says here that idea that he would not eat anything that was improperly cooked or gathered out of season, there's also another interpretation for something that's out of season. In the Chinese, the characters literally can be translated as not the right time. So you wouldn't eat if it wasn't the right time. Now, this timing could also be the time of the day. So some commentators have said that he wouldn't eat outside of the 3 meal times. so breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's on meal times. He would only have these 3 meals and not snack. So he wouldn't be having other meals on top of that. So that is certainly another interpretation. But regardless of, all this detail, there's a general principle here that Confucius, he wasn't eating for his own self-indulgence, for his own enjoyment, for greed, but actually he was eating for his physical well-being, and also, as you can see, he ate with moderation. So there's also ideas here of food hygiene, of thinking about the environment, eating vegetables in season, and also the way that the animals were slaughtered. This idea of the proper way of cooking and seasoning, etc. So this idea of Confucius's diet also sheds light on how he lived in his daily life. So then that sort of makes us think about, how does that correspond to his actual philosophy? A lot of the text of the Analects talks about is Confucius and his quotes. So as it says here, this particular quote states that, when an exemplary person, a person who's trying to cultivate their character, when they eat, they don't eat to seek satiety. They don't, think about how the food tastes and then, eat to complete fullness. Also, when they choose a dwelling, they're not concerned about the comfort. It doesn't matter if it's not 5-star accommodation. And on top of that, they are attentive to affairs, careful of their words, look to those who have the way to correct themselves. And that's the kind of person who would be considered as one who loves to learn, so learning about the way. And you can see that, here, based on the different observations that we just covered, that Confucius really ticks all the boxes. He actually walks the talk. We already mentioned his dietary habits, but on top of that, in the Grand Temple, when he's asking about the ceremony, he's very careful, very attentive to the ceremony, and always looking to those who might be more cultivated, might be more expert in this field to correct himself and to constantly improve himself. And so he actually is doing as he says. So much so that, the students who wrote down these words, who noted what Confucius was doing in his work, at home, etc., the way they write it shows that, he wasn't even thinking about, putting on an act. It was just what he did. It was a natural part of who he was. And he really believed in this idea of ritual etiquette, this idea of respecting others, so much so that in his everyday life, or to the, very detailed minutiae of his life, it was always in consideration of others and showing, and ultimately showing his students that this is really the way of learning, that, if you really enjoy your learning, this is how you might act. So when we think about Confucius, obviously we think about an exemplary teacher. So it was through Confucius's example, the way he lived his life, that he brings his philosophy to life, that his students around him were inspired, that they, even though he traveled to the various states, which was very, very challenging, experienced a lot of difficulties and hardships, many of his students continued to accompany him on this very difficult journey. And of course, his words, the texts that he compiled live on after him. And these observations about his life are really what continue to inspire us today, 2,000 years later. And that's because of his exemplary conduct. So when we think about this teaching, there's a really, very common idiom, which literally means that the nourishing spring, breeze, and rain. Okay, but actually, what it really means is that the way that an exemplary teacher, through their words and examples, they influence the students imperceptibly. So it's like, so the idea of transforming others is something that happens very naturally and also spontaneously, like the spring that comes, and the weather, the changes in the weather, then induce internal changes in the plants, the flowers, the animals that allow them to flourish and thrive, and the flowers bloom. That's not because spring forces them in any way. It's just that the spring weather is that weather, and the flowers or the different plants in their own time will develop. So similarly, this exemplary person, or you call them an exemplary teacher, is able to bring about change because of their own actions, which then creates a natural and spontaneous, and really moves others to exemplify, to also emulate them. Now, in the last few minutes, I'd like to share with you a particular story from a time in the Chinese history called the Ming Dynasty, so around the 16th century, about how this kind of idea might work on a more individual level. So not just through teaching or through government, but within our daily lives. Now, this is a story of three brothers, and they're very close, but the youngest brother is a bit of a rebel, and he sort of, whilst the other brothers, they're very accomplished, they've passed their exams. In fact, the second brother, his name's Chen Shi, and he has actually passed the highest level of the exams, the presented scholar degree of that time in Imperial China. And so both the elder brothers are quite accomplished. Unfortunately, the younger brother is very different, and he doesn't really care about his career or study, and just goes out every day and comes back very late at night drunk. Now, the older brother, well, obviously the whole family's concerned, and the older brother gives the young brother a talking to, and really exerts his authority to say, look, everyone's concerned about you, get your act together, you need to do work, otherwise what's to become of you? Now, despite all this nagging, the younger brother doesn't change. And then so the second brother, Chen Shi, he sort of decides to take another strategy. What he does is that he waits up at night, stays at the gate, and welcomes his younger brother home. This is the middle of the night, and sort of asks him, really cares for him genuinely, in the sense that he says, well, how are you feeling? Is it really cold? Have you eaten? You must be hungry, and waits for his brother to be settled in bed before he goes to bed and locks up and everything. Now this happens over a number of days, and after a while, his younger brother comes home earlier, and then after a few more days, he actually then completely changes and doesn't go out anymore. What happened? What was so effective about what Chen Shi did? You could say, of course, that both the older brothers, they were already correct. They were already great scholars, hardworking, etc. But why was it that they couldn't transform or change their younger brother until Chen Shi specifically, reached out and really cared for him? Well, what happened was that, through genuine care and the sincerity of Chen Shi in sort of waiting up for his brother, his brother realized that, and, sort of was moved by this genuine care. And because of that, he could see that obviously that this was something that his brother was really concerned about, his behavior, but also that his behavior had consequences for others. If his brother was waiting up for him until the early hours of the morning, then what about his brother? How could his brother function the following day? He had work to do, and he had to perform at work as well. So he realized that his actions had consequences not only for himself but for others, and therefore this genuine care helped him reflect on himself. Now, this correcting oneself then is not just to say, oh, okay, well, I do a really good job as a child in the family. I look after my parents, and therefore others should just naturally follow. It's actually also about reaching out to others and ensuring that it's the attitude that we have towards everyone, that this correcting ourselves is correcting our perspectives towards everyone around us. Are we fulfilling all of our responsibilities, not just to our parents, not just to our older brother, but also to our younger brother? And how can I reach out to that person in different ways to help them? And that too is correcting oneself in a sense of really reaching out to them with the right intentions, as opposed to simply expecting them to change or transform when you haven't really changed your attitude towards them. So you can see that these 4 words, this idea, correcting oneself and transforming others, is quite deep. It's very it's something that we all need in our lives. And the key take-home message is that we can't transform others unless we correct ourselves first. And that's not just through our actions, but also in our attitudes and our perspectives of the other person, that there has to be a genuine care, concern, sincerity for others before we can overcome that barrier and help them and really develop them. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.